Hello, everyone, and welcome to our little mini workshop on writing for interactivity. It's my pleasure to introduce Emily Craven, our amazing CEO and a author herself. So she has a lot of experience in this space. Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you, and let's get going on learning. These are our
Cool.
deep dives into each of these subjects. So deep dive into this. You can feel free to find Emily throughout the day, but hopefully this gives you a good base to get up and running.
Exactly. So in this particular one, we are going to really deep dive into how to write for interactive projects. In particular, at the start, I am going to focus really on grounding people in location, but also we're going to look a little bit about if you're going to do a branching narrative or a choose your adventure, how do you go about writing multiple endings? And then we'll look a little bit about building out the story structure for an interactive story. So first thing is first, the point about developing these skill sets is that we want to help you diversify your writing craft. Maybe you just write for theatre. Maybe you just write for marketing. Maybe you just write for novels or short stories. Today, what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and diversify your writing skills so that you have ways of being able to move into these more developing, interactive, digital collaborations that allow you to make multiple revenue streams and build a career as a writer in particular in today's world. So when we are writing for interactivity, and in particular for when someone is standing in a particular location, right? So we've started at X location by the Fairmont Hotel. What do we need to do to really ground people? So you need to initially describe the ordinary world that they are standing in. You're acknowledging that they're standing in the everyday, real world that is surrounding them, that's not in the dystopian future, that is not in the time travel past, right? So you need to describe the ordinary at the start of a story so that they can ground themselves and trust you as an author. So if you watched my previous mini workshop, it's about telling them that this statue is to the left, that statue is to the right. You're going to be hearing music out of this particular venue. All the cars are going past this way. So you're building trust and reliability by acknowledging real world features. And then you must introduce the scenario or the breaking of normality. Now, because you're standing in location, it needs to be quick and sharp, this change or this break in reality, because you only really have a short amount of time in each location to grab them into a story and keep their attention. So when you're breaking that normality and introducing your scenario, so in this case, I'm talking mainly about fiction where, you know, an alien spaceship comes down, a time traveler steps out of a portal, a young girl staggers up to you covered in blood. Like you want to be able to introduce that very quickly and introduce that change in mood to whatever genre that you're going to be playing in, whether it's fantasy, sci-fi, mystery, whatever that might be, comedy, and introduce essentially that fiction that's going to come in there. There might be characters that you introduce, but then you also need to give them a point of no return. You have to send them on a quest of some kind, right? And so whether it is them learning history by taking a particular walking tour to them finding buried treasure, there has to be a reason why they are going to walk from start point to end point, right? And so, like, what is the quest, the mission, the reason why they are going on this story, following these characters, making these choices? If you were doing a choose your adventure, if you're doing a linear story, why would they bother to go from location to location to learn more about the story? Like, what sort of story are we on here? And so, similarly to fiction and nonfiction, you want to acknowledge that even though the user is a character in this story, that they're going to have feelings about an alien spaceship suddenly appearing in the sky. Oh, that's not normal, you think to yourself. Like, so you do need those kind of character reactions and speculations of like, what's going on? That looks like a time trip. Like, so you still need that kind of inner dialogue that you might see in a film or in a book or whatever that might be. But you also use it to give reasoning between, particularly in a choose your own adventure, if you're presenting them with like multiple choices, you also need to be able to give them reasoning behind why they would choose one motivation or one thing over another. So the final thing that I want to talk about just in the beginnings, like when you're writing a start, is that you not only want to describe any choices if you're writing a branching narrative or any puzzles, for example, but you also need to give exact instructions on how to get to the next location in that story. And the reason why you might want to do that is because you might have someone who is doing this story who has a visual disability, and so they can't see the map in the app. And so they need audio instructions to be able to go from one place to the next, right? It might be because Google Street View tries to take you around a bunch of different streets to be able to get there, when in actual fact, there's a staircase that you can just go up, right? So that's why you want to also put in actual walking instructions to something, obviously, unless, you know, you're giving a riddle and so you're not giving away the location, they've got to solve it. But you really want to describe not only the choices that maybe they are taking or the puzzles that they are solving, but also how do they get to the next part of the story to unlock that part of the story. The other thing that you want to consider in interactive stories where a user is a part of the story, they are literally stepping into the story as a character, is neutrality, right? When anybody could step into the shoes of this character, you need to consider the fact that they could be of any gender, any age, any race, right? They could be a kid, they could be an adult, they could be a teenager, they could be anyone, right? And so you want to be careful around like the languaging that you use, but also like what they do. So I remember getting a bunch of feedback from a project that we ran one year where someone was like, I would never rugby tackle someone, right? I am a woman, I would never rugby tackle someone. So that's like, that was considered to be gendered language. So you can do it on purpose, right? So obviously if you want them to step into very specific shoes, so you wanted them to step into the life of a veteran living on the streets, you want them to step into the shoes of a neurodivergent person, in that case, you might describe a specific race, age, gender, etc., where they are taking on a persona, but you will be, if you're going to be intentional about that, you need to make sure that that intention is clear in the description or the blurb for your story. The other thing to consider also is like the backstory that you are giving people as a user, right? So if you're saying to them, your brother came to meet you and you don't have a brother in real life, even though this is a fiction, it still breaks the trust, it breaks the believability a little bit. So generally, I tend to recommend that rather than like close family members, that you use people like teachers, friends, strangers, time travel guides to be those characters, so that you don't run into those breaking the fourth wall problems. The other thing that a lot of people like to do, particularly in their interactive stories, is that we get a lot of dystopian stories and we get a lot of time travel stories, right? And obviously you are standing in the real present version of your city. It's not a dystopian wasteland yet. It is not what it was back in the past. So you need to make sure that there is something in the location that you can hang your fiction on that is still there in that place, even if it's just an incorporation of historical images into the artwork or whatever that might be, right? You need to make sure that that is incorporated in there somewhere, so that they're not just being taken to an empty lot that doesn't have anything in it anymore, and you're trying to tell them there's a great historic hotel here, right? The other thing that's really interesting, particularly when writing for interactive projects, is that if you choose to do a branching narrative where you're doing a choose your own adventure, you can do different things down different branches. So we had one story that a creator made where down one branch it ended up being a sci-fi, down another branch it ended up being a spy thriller, down another branch it ended up being a fantasy, down another branch it ended up being like a PI mystery, right? And so they were able to explore different genres down different branches, or they were able to explore different themes, one about, you know, reconciliation, one about love, one about history, right? And even if you decide that you don't want to make a fictional based story, if you're wanting to make a non-fiction kind of maybe a walking tour, you could give people the choice of like, you don't have to mix art and history and architecture and all of it into like one, you know, linear story. You can have them choose. Do they want to go along the art path? Do they want to go along the history path? Do they want to go along? And it keeps things contained. It allows you to keep things thematic. And the app allows you to be able to break those up into different locations. The other thing to consider is that, like, if you're going to be in the physical world, use those hidden histories of things that happened in that building, when that came up, how that weird building looks like a mushroom, like, like use all of those things, those important causes, the protests that happened, the histories that happened, like use all of that. But the other thing to consider also is attention span. If you're standing physically in a place, you're not going to sit there reading something for 10 minutes or listening to the audio narration of that thing for 10 minutes, right? When you're getting people to move and walk through an experience, you want to be quick, you want to be snappy, right? No more than 3 minutes in a location. So if you're like reading something out, you want it to only result in someone standing in a place for 3 minutes. They might stand there a little bit longer because maybe you get them to do an activity or solve a puzzle or whatever that might be, but the actual story component, you don't want it to be too long. You want it to be snappy. Again, consider the age group you're writing for. If you're writing for children, beware of swearing. You can write for adults. We have a whole gamut of people. It's not just families or children that use this. It is adults, millennial, Gen Z that will do things. So we have stories that range from M15 plus all the way down to G. Any questions? I might pause for questions here.
Yeah, so a couple questions for you, Em. The first one is, so how you lightly touched on it, but how long should stories be, and like how much content should be in each spot?
Yeah, so stories, as we said, with a story, you really want to make sure that you're cognizant of attention span, because like they're standing around traffic noise, like they're wanting to get onto the next thing, explore a new thing, right? And so you want to make sure, as we said, that you kind of want to keep it to like the 3 minute mark, particularly if it is a choose your adventure, outdoor escape room, where it's kind of like a fictional adventure experience. If you're doing a walking tour, it can actually be slightly longer. So if you were doing a walking tour and you're having walking tour stops, people will tolerate being in a single spot for 5 minutes, like 5 to 8 minutes even, if it's nonfiction and they're getting like nonfiction information. But you wouldn't want to make it any longer than that. And the other thing to consider as well is that a story in total, most of our stories that are on the platform, whether it's a walking tour, whether it's a choose your own adventure, whether it's an outdoor escape room, generally will average 4,000 words, right? They will sometimes get to 8,000 words if like a creator has had like a month, 6 weeks to build out a story, right? But if you only have 2 days, like you really want to cap it at like 4,000, if anything.
So that's in the story and as a whole, not each stop.
Correct, not each stop. At each stop, say you have 10 stops, you only want that to be 400 words a stop. Right, 400 to 500 words a stop. So you'll generally find that 500 to 700 words will give you 3 minutes of audio.
Okay, that's good to know. And can you walk while giving? Can you like walk with the audio? Like, well, how does that
So it
work
depends on
with,
how you do
do you
it,
have to stay in
right?
the same spot or how?
Yeah, so it depends on how you do it. So it depends on whether you like want audio narration, right? Because if the main way that people are going to take this in is by listening, right? You can walk, but you do not know how fast people will walk. You do not know if they're super speedy and they're going to get from one place to the other in 2 minutes versus 3 minutes versus 5 minutes, right? So it's difficult to be like, now walk to the left and walk to the right, because like the app can't tell when they have reached left and right to be able to make sure it delivers that instruction at that exact time for them to turn, because you don't know how fast someone's walking, right? So my suggestion also in terms of safety, right? Again, they're probably going to have earbuds in or headphones. You probably, in a fiction or a choose your adventure, you want them to be standing in a spot while they experience a story rather than walking, right? So you don't necessarily want them running into a scene. You want to start a scene with them already there in the location and that scene is playing out around you. And you're maybe allowing them to kind of like walk around and check out plaques, or historic notes or things like that to answer like a puzzle or a question. But you kind of want to try and keep it into that one area. And if you do make it a walking meditation, just know that you want to make the stops far enough apart that if they are a faster walker or a slower walker, it doesn't matter.
I think that, yeah, that leads into my next little question is, was it better then to have multiple shorter stops if we wanted to have, or is it better to have like longer stopping points and larger distances between those?
It depends on your audio, right? So you can have smaller, shorter stops that are closer. If things are closer together, they can be smaller, they can be shorter, right? They can be super snappy. But if you're making people walk long distances, you want significant chunks of awesomeness at each location, right?
Mm.
So if I have to walk 100 meters, then I'm fine listening to only 1 minute of audio narration from a script, right? But if I have just walked half a kilometer or half a mile and you've only given me 1 minute of story, I'm going to be pretty pissed. Right? So you've got to make it worth the while. If you're making them walk this long distance, is it worth the while? Do you have stopping off points along the way? And how are they doing that? If they're doing it by cycle, it's going to be less burdensome than if they walked, less burdensome than if they drove.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Onward. Writing endings. So particularly in Choose Your Own Adventures, a reader is asked to determine, or a user is asked to determine the next course of action, right? They're given choices, and depending on the choices they make, they might go to location X or location Y. But because they have physically put themselves into this and they are literally walking through the streets, they're expending energy to be able to get from the start to the end, right? So your endings, if you have multiple different endings, or even if you just have one ending, but you've made them walk a really long way, right? It cannot be a subtle ending. You cannot get to the end of walking a mile, a kilometer, and then be told it was all a dream, because you will be even more angry than if you had just read an entire book where you were told it was all a dream, right? So it can't be subtle. So but the great thing about having branching narratives or choose your adventures that have multiple endings is that those endings can be wins, they can be losses, they can be partial wins. So like kill off characters, right? Because that's only down one branch, and down another branch, you save the day and you scare off the alien invaders, right? Or you have endings where like, you've saved the girl, but you've lost the treasure, right? You've saved the boy, but you've lost the time travel pool, right? So you can get, as long as you're not subtle, you can get different endings that allow you to explore a full range of emotions, right? And it also gives a very realistic sense of unpredictability, because it puts weight to the choices that people make. So when they have to make a choice at each location, they could end up losing. And so it makes them debate things more as a result. And also, when you're doing like different choices, you want to make sure that it's based on the motivation, like a story or a plot motivation, rather than them just going from point A to point B. Because if they are a tourist to the city, they're not going to know what the Fairmont Hotel versus Churchill Square is like, right? So to ask them to make a decision based on location when they don't know that city well, or even if you're a local and maybe you just don't spend a lot of time in downtown. So you want to make sure that any choices that they make are intrinsically tied to the story rather than to the location itself. And then that gives you an realistic sense of unpredictability, so that when they end up at a various story ending, they get excited about the fact that they can go back and do it again. And so 40% of people will actually go back and try another branch in a story. We have the statistics for that. So, allow yourself to explore a full range of emotions and themes. Allow your musicians to score a full range of emotions. Allow your actors to give a full range of characters. But it also allows and encourages people to come back and try something again and again and again. And it allows, to increase things like marketing, because like people are arguing about what ending they ended up in and getting them to participate, right? So like there are also different ways, as we spoke about in the interactivity piece, where you can also get them to participate a bunch in doing different activities as well. And each new participation, each new puzzle, each new choice they make just gives them more and more buy-in. Any questions about that, Tim, before we move to interactive structures?
No, this might bridge us to interactive structures, but the last question I really have is you mentioned music and like audio. So how much text should be on the screen versus other media formats?
Right. So generally what we will find is that people will mainly do stories based off audio or video, because it allows them to look around the space and listen, and imagine themselves in that space, right? And so the text, generally, we will put it in there for accessibility reasons. So if someone has an audible disability where they can't hear things very well, we make sure that the text is there so that it gives accessibility for that story to someone who may have a disability. But it also means that things like instructions for walking between locations are actually written down. So I would encourage the text to be there. But I would also encourage that you have some sort of audio or video component, and that audio or video component is at the top of the screen or in the feature sections, because that is the most likely way that people will consume your story. But the text is great for accessibility.
Perfect.
Beautiful. All right. So we talked a little bit about structures. So this is a choose your own adventure structure or a branching narrative structure, where essentially you are giving people choices. So, they're following character A rather than character B. They've decided to make choice C rather than choice D, right? And so at each point, it kind of splits and allows you to go further down. Now, one thing that I should note is that on Story City, it can't track whether you have been to the advertiser versus calling the Prime Minister, right? So it can't tell what previous locations that you have been to and deliver different versions of the aliens announce their need for balls versus the aliens try to shrink people in water. So you can't make differences or subtle changes as you go down those kind of layers, because there's no way to track very subtle, minute changes. You would have to make, for example, here, if you wanted to specifically reference something that you told the Prime Minister, or you want to specifically reference the newspaper that you spoke to, you would have to have two different versions of this content to be able to reflect the fact that you wanted that piece of information to continue all the way through. So that's something just to keep in mind, that as you're splitting things and moving things down, that you want to kind of keep in mind. So if you, for example, wanted them to collect like loot as part of like a D&D quest, you would essentially be relying on an honors system, right? Where, maybe you have dice rolls, or you're asking them to note down the points that they get, so that at the end they have a choice between saying whether they have under 10 points, under 15 points, under 20 points, and they select the right button, right? So that tends to be how you handle those situations. Now, the first one is kind of a very simple split by two, split by two, split by two, but you could obviously split and loop around in a bunch of different ways. You can kind of expand your way out and go back in. You can kind of loop around in this crazy style here. But it's really up to you and how complicated you want to make it. But like, particularly if you're wanting to try branching narratives and choose your adventures, which is primarily what we've done in Story City, is that we're really well known for our choose your adventures. Keeping to a simple structure kind of on this bottom left is probably your best chance for a 2-day project. And then finally, there are other types of non-branching interactive structures, and those generally involve escape room style gamification, right? So this here is actually kind of a flow chart of someone's escape room, right? Where you have to find XYZ toolbox, flashlight, electrical panel, etc. And then you need to solve a puzzle, find a code, whatever that is, to unlock a new piece, to get all the way down to your final win, right? And so those might be puzzles, riddles. You might be asking them to find something, enter a date, enter numbers, enter letters. But you can have that kind of unlocking sequence where you can be really hardcore about it and be like, I'm sorry, if you don't solve this riddle, you don't get to do the end of this story, right? To being generous about it and like having multiple hints. And so there's a modal pop-up workshop where you'll be able to see how you can set up little hints using pop-up modals. But that's all for interactive stories and writing for interactivity and for location. We will see you at the next mini workshop.
Thanks, Sam.